Hey everybody, welcome back to Climb by VSC. Each week we interview innovative founders, category experts, and the most active climate investors about their perspectives, lessons, and best practices for company building and climate tech. Today I'm thrilled to be joined on Climb by a dear friend. Meera Clark is an investor at Redpoint Ventures, a firm that has invested in some of the world's leading technology companies over the past 20 years. Names that you will know and recognize like Draftkings, HIMS, Netflix, Ramp, Snowflake, Stripe, thredUp, and many, many more. Earlier this year, Meera joined Redpoint from VSC Ventures, where she invested in startups through a world-positive lens. Meera also writes a wonderful newsletter called The Conscious Consumer, and I'm excited to chat with her about what role consumer choice plays in addressing the climate crisis. All right, Meera, thank you so much for joining me on Climb by VSC.
Jay, thanks so much for having me. It's crazy after 5-6 years? I don't even know how long it's been since we've known each other, but it's fun to continue having the excuses to collaborate.
I know. I feel like it's been many, many different funds that you and I have worked at, and now we are finally here able to collaborate on something. So quite a journey it's been for both of us. Well, let's start there, actually. So you've worked and learned from some fantastic investors and funds like Obvious and Redpoint, and more recently you've been thinking and writing about climate tech. So where did this interest in climate tech begin, and what draws you to the category today?
Yeah, Jay, I think it comes down to kind of two primary elements. One is kind of my general excitement or propensity towards the space. The other is kind of the classic timing question, which can be a little bit harder to answer. But as it relates to my interest, I think it was really instilled in me at a very young age. I grew up with a little bit of this hippy-dippy dad, went to Berkeley in the 60s, which was slightly unusual to say the least, growing up in North Carolina, which was very conservative, at least at the time. But I think kind of thinking about conscious consumption or the way that we navigated the world around us in a manner that both kind of gave back and was also, gracious and considerate of kind of what we had been given is something that was very much ingrained in me as a child. And so as I kind of navigated the world around me, I, found myself gravitating towards like-minded individuals. And so I would say it's definitely something I, as a consumer, have always cared about. That said, from an investment perspective, it's a trend I've been monitoring for quite some time, though maybe kind of only dove into in earnest more recently. I think, it goes without saying, and we could certainly go down the rabbit hole at some other point in time, but Clean Tech 1.0 was a pretty challenging time for the VC ecosystem. A lot of money was lost, a lot of scars were left. And so as I made my move into investing for the first time, 5 years ago, it was very much with this mission-driven orientation. My first investing job was actually at Morgan Stanley, investing in women and multicultural founders off balance sheet as part of their accelerator. But while I felt the ESG alignment there, within climate, I think the jury was still out in terms of if and when this category would be investable again. Fast forward to the 3 years that I spent at Obvious Ventures, which you mentioned is a mission-driven venture capital fund in B Corp based here in the Bay. And the fund was actually very active in kind of, let's say, the broader climate ecosystem with this idea of sustainable systems. How can we make dusty industries, let's say, for lack of a better term, a little bit more climate conscious or, let's say, complementary to the planet versus, living in conflict. And so that could be anything from sustainable materials to, flying electric taxis to anything in between. And so I would say very much out there moonshot bets in terms of a lot of the earlier bets that Obvious was making, let's say in Fund 1 and Fund 2. Fast forward to the past couple of years, and I think the opportunity set in this ecosystem has very much exploded, probably due to two things. One being kind of consumers' general awareness and excitement for the category. I think coming out of the pandemic, there's been this real, yearning, not only with, the hypey Gen Zs, but even with, millennials, Gen X, boomers, you name it, to be a little bit more mindful of our communities and protect them, because I think we've seen, how traumatic the carnage to our communities could be from anything from a pandemic to California wildfires and everything in between. And so I think consumer awareness has very much grown. Similarly, I think with the Biden administration taking over, we've seen, leaps and bounds being made on the regulatory front, which, I think they've taken a fairly elegant, carrot and stick approach to as it relates to both putting in place much stronger incentives to do the right thing, whether it's as a consumer or as a business. And then maybe on a little bit more of the restrictive side, putting in place some pretty hefty fines or regulatory barriers, even if it's 2030, 2040, 2050 in terms of when they'll go into effect. I think that additional framing from the government has provided like a nice push-pull in addition to where consumers already find themselves leaning. And so, yeah, I feel like timing has never been better for this category, which makes me incredibly, incredibly excited.
I love hearing the clarity with which you sort of laid out the push-pull side of it, because I think that's absolutely true. And what feels different to me about this round, you mentioned sort of clean tech. What feels different about this round is I think clean tech was very much about energy and different sources of energy. And this feels very much about every industry, right? Whether you're talking about consumer consumption, plastics, food alternatives, and now even going to things like construction, which ends up being, 7 to 10% of emissions, even more so when you're talking about large cities like, we have lived in. So you recently wrote about the environmental era. You covered some of that thesis here just now. And you also shared a detailed climate SaaS market map in your wonderful newsletter, The Conscious Consumer. Can you elaborate on some of these subsegments and why you feel confident that there are unicorns to emerge from each of these categories?
Absolutely. I mean, I think to your point, what we've seen in this wave of climate excitement is that climate is not a sector. It is an overarching lens that we apply to almost every single category within the Redpoint portfolio, which is both exciting and overwhelming in terms of the number of areas that we can theoretically spend time. I think what's been interesting, kind of before unpacking the various pockets where we see opportunity, but what's been interesting with this wave is you look at kind of the proliferation of climate unicorns and how quickly they are becoming unicorns versus the last wave is a lot more of today's climate leaders are more software-like or marketplace-like in orientation. They aren't these heavy, lab bench risk science projects that require hundreds of millions to build and take, several years to even prove out. And so you're actually seeing these companies serve as much better investments for investors, which is exciting because it then lends itself or encourages additional capital to continue to flow into the category. So for me, that's really exciting as we think about, whether or not this category is investable and how our LPs are going to feel about us deploying, hopefully, a meaningful percentage of the portfolio into various pockets of the theme. Taking a step back, though, we as a fund have really mapped climate into two separate worlds, one being the consumer-facing applications and the other being more enterprise-oriented approaches. Within consumer, because we tend towards, more capital-efficient businesses or businesses where we feel like there should be some strong network effects to drive scale, we found ourselves gravitating towards three areas of the consumer-facing side of climate. The first would be this idea of conscious commerce. And so how can you enable, Americans to live their lives with the same ease and delight that they are today, but in a way that is, much more conducive to preserving the planet. One investment we announced last month is in a company called The Rounds, which I think is an amazing example of this. The Rounds you can almost think of as a more sustainable Amazon in that it is delivering everyday essentials to your door. Think soaps, flour, cereal, you name it. And it's doing it in a way that's reducing friction and hopefully, reducing costs for consumers, not asking them to take on this undue burden so that they can do good while also living their lives. So within conscious commerce, I think you can think of anything from, circular economy to shared economy plays to these more sustainable materials and packaging bets, what have you. So much to be done across a pretty wide range of business orientations. Moving on from there, I think transportation, is a challenging space, but one that cannot ever be left out of the climate equation, given, how relevant or how, I guess, impactful those emissions are to the overall emission profiles of consumers. We obviously have seen the Teslas, the Rivians, the Birds, the Limes get a lot of buzz in this category. I think that some corners of this category are probably more conducive to other forms of capital than venture capital, very open to being proven wrong. But I would say as we think about what makes sense for us in transportation, it might be more on the financing side, or on the EV charging infrastructure side as you think about, home retrofits in that space, which then I guess brings us to the third category that we're really excited about, which is this broader ecosystem of residential retrofits. With the Inflation Reduction Act, there is hundreds of billions of dollars up for grabs as it relates to implementing more sustainable solutions ranging from, heat pumps to, these EV chargers, for example. And so we see a lot more interest in this category from consumers today. Furthermore, unfortunately, given everything that's happening with the Russia-Ukraine conflict and, the resulting implications to energy prices, it's becoming, less of a nice to have, nice for the planet approach and more of a very much a cost-effective alternative for consumers. And so we expect to see more momentum on that side. And I think what's been exciting is the number of really, really smart and really impressive people that have kind of migrated to that category from a company formation perspective, particularly at seed and Series A. Moving over to the enterprise side, I would say there's probably 4 areas that we think about. I think there are many, many more, but we try to simplify it for our minds at least. And we kind of think about, 4 primary categories, one being employee activation. So how can you empower your employees to take action from a climate perspective? I think there's debate in this category, to say the very least, as it relates to whether or not employers should be pushing this onto their employees, one. And 2, what claims these employers can make. Because, as you and I have both seen, so many of them, I think it's 60% of the Fortune 500, maybe, have stated, net zero targets or meaningful emissions reductions targets without any sort of plan as to how they can possibly get there. And so people are wondering, can corporates make claims on the reductions that their employees are taking if the corporates themselves are funding it? Maybe, we'll see. But I think it's an interesting theme to at least track. I would say the other 3 pockets for us within the more B2B software space are a little bit more traditional, if you will, as it relates to areas of opportunity. One of those being risk analysis and mitigation. I think, more to come on that front as we get greater guidance from the SEC in terms of what they are looking for from a disclosure perspective. But particularly for financial institutions, we feel like this is in many ways the tip of the spear because they are expecting more and their investors are expecting more in terms of what is tracked, disclosed, and offset from a risk perspective. 2 would be kind of comprehensive carbon management. I think this is where you've probably seen the most activity in terms of chatter, company formation, what have you. And so that could be anything from, simply assessing your benchmarks and what your emissions look like today to offsetting, to hopefully, much harder to do, but hopefully implementing some reduction strategies as well. What we've seen in this category, which again is an opinion, so very open to being proven wrong, but we've seen a lot of the more vertical specific solutions emerge as early leaders just because the data exercise with these is so complex. And so being able to solve for a smaller but very specific set of pain points or areas of focus we found has been helpful in getting companies up the curve to digitization or automation versus these being like overly, consultant-like approaches or services-heavy approaches to data collection. And then the final category would just be kind of these supply chain solutions, kind of thinking about scope 3 and beyond. In terms of network effects, in many ways, this is like the most interesting ecosystem, right? Also really freaking hard to build from a data verification perspective. And so all of these present their own sets of challenges as it relates to scalability. That said, I think particularly on the B2B side, we look at HubSpot, Salesforce, Oracle, all these legacy tech players that have been around forever, but once they're integrated into a company, they are there for so long. And so it's my suspicion or my hope that we'll be able to see some similar dynamics within climate as these companies get wedged in as, the Carta for, carbon offsets, or fill in the blank, name your comparison. But yeah, it is, it's an exciting time to say the least.
Yeah, no, that was a wonderful and very thorough sort of coverage on both sides of that spectrum. What really excited me to chat with you right off the jump was talking about the consumer side, because frankly, you're one of the first folks on the show who has actually been excited about the consumer opportunity. Actually, it feels like a lot of climate investors, and I'd include myself to a degree too, just given the mix of companies that I see. I think they lean pretty heavy B2B. A lot of climate investors are feeling like the momentum shift needed is going to come from enterprises, because you can incentivize them a little bit better than from consumers, who it takes a lot of effort to incentivize anyway. And yet, each person making incremental changes on their own carbon footprint might not collectively even make that big of an impact. And so, the focus has become vertical and industry focused. What, I guess, gives you optimism about the consumer side of this? Like, why do you feel like there is so much opportunity just talking about the sort of consumer categories?
Yeah. I think for better, for worse, so much of investing is following the money. And with the IRA being implemented, I do think it is truly a game changer as it relates to the consumer opportunity. I would agree that, 5 years ago, even 2 years ago, a lot of the consumer opportunities were capped because people weren't willing to pay, or from a cost comparison perspective, you really couldn't justify investing in these sorts of solutions. However, which I guess I alluded to a little bit earlier, today, given the fact that it is not only a more delightful experience to go with some of these climate conscious solutions, but it's also a lot cheaper for consumers. To me, that's really the kicker, is the cost question, cost and convenience. Two is, as we kind of think about, what is the consumer looking for coming out of COVID? So much of the wellness, the woo-woo wellness elements pre-COVID or even during COVID, right? You and I saw everyone tweeting about their meditation routines and the 11 hours of sleep they were getting, which is awesome. But guess what? Like, unfortunately today, I go to work dinners and I drink wine and, I might not get the best sleep, and that's okay. But I feel like we're actually seeing a lot more of the world transition from this like enlightened well-being into more of a survival mode and a little bit more of like a pragmatic approach to consumption. They're feeling the pain from an economic perspective. They're finding themselves stretched from a bandwidth perspective as they're juggling family, work, everything else. And so as people think about, what defines survival, or like what does our community need to survive, climate is huge there. And I think given, unfortunately, the natural disasters that we've seen over the past 2 to 3 years, it's becoming increasingly impossible to ignore. Furthermore, it's funny, I'm sure you hear the same things from your friends, but the number of my friends who have kids coming home from school saying, Mom, we can't use paper towels anymore. We need to use cloth napkins, or whatever it is. I think that, the increased incentive, or like the nudges that we are getting from younger generations are getting and stronger, which, leads you to get pulled into this vortex of, engagement or activism or change. And so, yes, I hear you, because I think, I hear a lot of the same things that you hear as it relates to people trending towards, more software businesses or more B2B businesses. Because let me tell you, the recurring revenue streams of those things are a lot easier, or help you sleep a lot better than having to go out and earn revenue every month like a consumer business does. But I do think that now is a really special and unique opportunity in terms of shifting priorities for consumers. And I think at the end of the day, investment returns are also dependent on the entry price that you're getting. And so many of these B2B solutions, even pre-launch, are getting bid up so much. And so I think there is an argument to be made for, making a relative value play with some of this consumer exposure. But we'll see how it plays out.
No, I like that. I mean, some of the uphill battle that consumer companies will always have is around customer acquisition. One would hope that that's made a little bit easier because consumers are so focused on this. They want to have alternatives, and if they can find them reasonably priced. Like, I'll give you an example. I live in New York. I'm very lucky that we have the option to take a Revel. And now that Uber has increased its prices, they're basically comparable. But if I know one is electric and one is not, like, okay, given the chance, I would take the thing that's, of a comparable price but better for the environment. Those are consumer choices that, can be made on an active scale across 8 million people in the city, results in a very big change. The acquisition costs and the retention costs that every consumer company has to deal with, climate companies are going to have to deal with anyway, right? So it really just comes back to, can you excite users to care about this problem? And I guess your point is they already care. So hopefully it should be a little bit of an easier sell. I guess building on that point, Meera, like some funds are very focused on measuring, kilowatts of energy and kilotons of carbon reduction. And others, I think, focus more towards a directionally positive impact, right? To sort of phrase it that way. Where do you lean as an investor, and why is that sort of your chosen approach?
Yeah, I would say we lean towards more of a directionally positive impact, which is, it works for us. Totally get that it doesn't work for everyone. And I think in many ways that's also dependent, right, on what your LPs are asking for. I think for us, we think about this climate conversation as very much of an evolution. We are not going to get to, net zero tomorrow. And so as we think about, driving both education, engagement, and, more meaningful action longer term, we are trying to take steps in the right direction, which can hopefully take us leaps and bounds. We're not necessarily expecting people to be, fully engaged or aware or capable of doing this tomorrow. I think with a lot of these elements, there's also, true technical innovation, whether it's on the material side, you referenced, I think, cement or what have you. And so I think we recognize that the world will hopefully, I don't want to jinx it, will hopefully be better 10 years from now versus today in terms of what is possible. And so I feel like we want to kind of seize what is possible today or what consumers are willing to do today. Maybe they're not going to go fully vegan, but if they cut out meat twice a week and eat a Beyond Meat burger, like that's a win. And so kind of thinking through, how can we lead to that gradual progression in terms of improvement, I think aligns a little bit more with how we're thinking about the market.
Yeah. And given that you're investing relatively early, anywhere from first check to sort of, what we'll sort of say is general early stage, how do you ensure that quality deals find you, right? Kind of balancing that filter between inbound, often sort of cold opportunities versus taking a very thesis-driven, outbound approach. What's your process like?
Yeah, I will say, I think in many ways, at least for me, climate has been one of the easier areas to find deals. And the reason that is because the climate communities, both on the founder side, but also on the investor side, are so strong. 3 or 4 years ago, pre-COVID, a group of, let's say, mid-stage investors that were spearheaded by Priscilla Tyler at thredUp and Jessica Eastling, who was previously at Better Ventures, but is now at the Nature Conservancy, brought together maybe 30 of us or 40 of us to begin having these climate conversations of what can be or what should be, what is investable, what is not, what can we learn from Clean Tech 1.0. And, through in-person events, through COVID, through all the things, the community has grown and evolved and taken on different directions, which I think is wonderful. But I think having those people to, refer deals to chat through new ideas, what have you, I think has made the space a little bit easier to navigate. Similarly, I think it's a space, because it's newer, people are looking for guidance or funds to raise their hand and say, hey, I'm interested. And so I would not claim that we're there yet, but I would say we are trying to do a more deliberate job of, putting our ideas out there or sharing our learning so that, when an amazing founder is beginning to think through a seed stage raise or what funds are going to be on their radar, our hope and our dream is that Redpoint, can earn their spot on that list. And so we're thinking a lot about, more of the marketing side as well as we continue to build our own brand in the category.
Yeah, I find that was so true, especially in 2021 with the velocity of how quickly deals were moving, is the sort of content, the flag that you planted, out there was so important. I mean, again, our fund, a little bit different than Redpoint in that we're not leading deals, so we're co-investing with great folks such as yourself. So having a flag out there and folks knowing, okay, we come to VSC Ventures when we need PR and storytelling and narrative building, and that's what they do for us on the cap table. I could not agree with you more. It became so important because, we would have, if we were lucky, 2 weeks to meet a company, do our diligence, commit to a deal. I'm hoping, it feels like the winds are shifting away from that, and I'm hoping we get more time. Yeah, right? You and me both.
Fingers crossed.
But in the event that you don't, in the event that you do have a round that's moving quickly, that content, I think, continues to be really, really valuable for founders when they are building their dream cap table, right? Which I think a lot of the best founders still do. Going from general tech, I know you were doing a lot of stuff in wellness and health, to now moving into climate, what has surprised you the most?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say what has surprised me the most and excited me the most would be a little bit of what I referred to, and it's how quickly this space has taken off as it relates to trudging along, facing headwinds, being quote unquote investable, but freaking hard versus now, while it is still hard, the technical builds of a lot of these businesses really challenging. However, having so many more tailwinds or feeling like the winds are at your back as it relates to the dollars being deployed into the category, both by the government as well as investors, as well as the regulatory support for a lot of the change that we're all hoping to drive. To me, that's been probably the biggest shift versus healthcare, which, as you know, tends to be a slightly slower moving industry in terms of how payers adjust their strategies, if you will. So I would say that's been probably the biggest surprise on my end.
Yeah, I was actually going to think back to how quickly communities have come around this idea as well. The number of conferences that are coming up, the number of investor networks, investor dinners around climate. I want to believe sort of optimistically this is not just because it is a great capital opportunity, but also because there are investors that really care about this. And at the stages that we invest at, you kind of have to, right? Like we are a 10-year fund. You have to see this as a 10-year long opportunity because that's sometimes how long these things are going to take. It's, not to poo-poo Web3, but it's not going to be something that spikes and goes away in a couple of years. This is going to be with us for a decade. And so I like to hear that, actually the speed at which this thing has taken off finally feels like people are really caring about it. When I guess you have seen companies at all different stages now in your investing career, given how early that you're investing, what are a few things that you feel early stage companies do really well when they are raising their round from Redpoint?
Yeah, I would say there's probably 3 things in my world that I care the most about or we care the most about, regardless of whether they're B2B or B2C businesses. Whether you're selling to a business or a consumer, you still have customers. And so I think that customer acquisition motion is huge. We want to understand how efficiently you can engage customers, whether they're finding you or you're finding them, and what the payback on that looks like. So I would say that would be point 1, is kind of understanding how quickly can this flywheel really hit takeoff velocity 1. 2 would be understanding the ROI of the offering. I think we've seen some of these companies that are helping their customers make marketing claims, or it's, a nice little virtue signaling exercise, but like the true bottom line support or, regulatory rationale for why someone should invest in this isn't quite there. I think it might work in a great macro environment, but I think with wallets coming under pressure on both the enterprise and the consumer side of things, I think the rationale for why someone needs to or will pay for this needs to be really, really strong. And so that's something we think a lot about. And then finally is the team. And when I say team, I think one point, particularly at seed, that ends up being a sticking point for us is the technical element. Because climate in so many ways is a giant exercise in data, a lot of these teams that are pitching, technical moats or technical differentiation with tech that has not been built yet or tech that they have outsourced, it's a lot harder to underwrite. And so I think for us, a lot of what we get excited about at seed rather is, the dream that the founders are saying, and what gets us over the line, let's say at Series A, is the fact that they've been able to make that killer tech hire, or they've been able to build this really impressive, end-to-end experience that we think is truly a moat for the business. And so I think that technical moat is definitely something that's also top of mind, given the fact that this is not simply a marketing exercise. There really is, true differentiation on that vector.
Given the depth of knowledge sometimes that is needed, when we're talking about energy or even just the chemical compounds to create a less emissions heavy cement, I find myself pulling up my old AP chemistry book sometimes to understand this stuff. But I'm curious, do you have a team internally? Are you digging deep into the science about this? How do you get comfortable in sort of the technical aspects of the diligence, just given how wide climate investing is and how deep some of the tech is for these companies?
Yeah. So I guess I think about this in a few ways. First and foremost, just to be fully transparent, I would say we take a lot less, let's call it lab bench risk or scientific risk than a lot of other firms do. I think there are firms that I respect tremendously. Let's, call out Lower Carbon as an, extreme example, that have multiple PhDs on their team or climate scientists on their team. And that is fantastic. And guess what? They're going to understand this so much more deeply than us. And if a company is looking for the optimal, seed stage partner, it's probably going to be them versus us. And that's okay. We want founders to have the best possible partners on their cap table. So I would say we've shied away from a lot of these areas where we know it can drive, very much outsized impact as it relates to, the broader emissions equation. However, they're just not necessarily a fit for our team and our model. So I'll first and foremost caveat it with that. Two, I think the benefit of these communities across climate that I think you and I are both so excited about is that, you have access to experts and they are willing to help. I think a lot about how can I add as much value to other people, candidly, so that in that, diligence moment where you have 48 hours to come to a decision, do I feel comfortable asking for the favor and calling this person to pick their brain on probably a dumb topic, but a topic that, I don't have a fully formed perspective on. So I think about leveraging those networks a lot as well. The final thing I will say is that the role that Obvious candidly played in the climate investing landscape is pretty different than Redpoint. My partner, Andrew, at Obvious, was a Clean Tech 1.0 founder and executive. He is deep, deep, deep in terms of his understanding of the category. And so if a founder was choosing to work with Obvious, it was because, Andrew and the fund had a deeper understanding of the space than anyone else or anyone else on their cap table. On the flip side, if a fund or a company rather is coming to Redpoint to lead their round or co-lead their round, it's for a different set of skill sets. It's for our hiring support. It's for our marketing support. It's for our go-to-market support. And so, we think about positioning ourselves not as we understand, the chemical compound of your cement deeper than anyone else, but, we trust the rest of your cap table to, advise you on that front, and we're going to support you on something else. And so I think it's also an exercise in understanding what role you are supposed to play around the table, because everyone does not need to do everything. And if you're trying to do everything, you're probably not doing them all well. but understanding kind of like where your sweet spot is. VSC obviously does this very well as it relates to kind of the storytelling angle. And so we think a lot about that as well with companies in this category.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that, because that's my biggest advice to founders whenever I'm, whether going to like Techstars demo day or speaking to folks, is like, take an active role in the formation of your cap table, especially at seed stage, because these folks are going to be with you the longest. Put them to work, right? And actually ask them up front, be transparent with them. Here are the things that we need. Tell me which ones you can step up on. And, I take this from Shishir Mehrotra at Coda, who I think I heard this from a couple years ago, and it really sits with me. He's like, I look at every one of my investors as a highly engaged VP in my company. And I like assign them roles, and I check in every quarter, and I say, you were supposed to do X, Y, and Z. How much of this have you done? And I also like, on the flip side, folks like Alexis Ohanian and 776 that actually print out a quarterly report and say, we made these many intros, we put you on these podcasts. Like, that's, I think, the direction that I want the venture industry to go. And
totally.
I'm trying to encourage founders to demand more. Because look, fundraising, it sucks. It's such a long process that sometimes when you get that term sheet, all you want to do is like, okay, whoever is willing to write the check, come on in, let's go, let's shut this thing down so we can get back to building the company. And that's like a little bit sort of nearsighted sometimes, right? Because if you get the right folks around the table, now you've got your dream team. You've got folks that are really complementing each other versus, everybody trying to pretend they're the science expert, and they're not. Like, I'm never going to be that, but that's not my role, right?
Yeah.
I'm really happy to hear you say that. So I guess where we'll close, and this is where I love to close with all of our guests, because so much of the public discourse around climate has become like fatalist to the point of being demotivating. And I like to leave our listeners on a sense of urgency, but also hope and optimism. Meera, what is something that gives you a lot of optimism in this ongoing fight against climate change?
One of the things that makes me the most excited about all of the activity that we're seeing is the broader mission's ability to bring consumers together and to reunite communities that I think have become fractured or a little bit more distant over the course of COVID. Whether it is circular economy solutions, sharing economy solutions, you name it, you're seeing people engage with one another, sharing goods or experiences with one another, looking to work with one another in a way that I think very few other movements have been able to effectively aggregate at this scale. And so for me, it is my hope that as we all talk about, where is the soul of our communities gone or what have you, it's my hope that, this broader movement will be able to reignite a little bit of that and bring us back to, kind of the more community-centric orientation of years or decades past.
Well, look, I think, it's such a great point, because it is all hands on deck when it comes to climate. Like, this is not something that a small subset of us can choose to make a contribution to, and it sort of fixes itself. And so I think the more that there are communities, and even if it's sort of selfish, right? You want your area to be, fire resilient. You want your area to have emergency services when there is a flood or there is a climate disaster. Using that to bring communities together and using that to bring like-minded people together will hopefully only accelerate the active effort that people are taking towards fixing this. So, Meera, I am so grateful for your time today. I think my two biggest things that I'm taking away are, one, even on the early stage side, there is effort that is needed for consumers. And if we can back companies that are going to make that effort a little bit easier, a little bit sort of on cost parity, that's going to be all the better for it. And I think secondly, was sort of where we closed our conversation, which is around this idea of founders building, cap tables with investors that are serving them. And when it comes to climate, that doesn't just mean having the smartest PhDs, but it also means having the right platform services and frankly, just engaged and excited investors that are willing to ride with you for the decade that it's going to take to fix this problem. So those are my two biggest takeaways. And I'm grateful that Redpoint is excited about climate. I'm grateful that you're investing in this, because I just want to share deals with you, and hopefully we get to find one to do together very soon. So Meera, thank you so much for joining me on Climb by VSC.
Jay, thanks so much for having me, and hopefully we get to do it again soon.
Hope so. Thank you for listening into this episode of Climb by VSC. A few quick shout-outs before you go. Our thanks to Meera Clark from Redpoint Ventures for joining us to share more about her journey into climate investing and the consumer activation happening in climate innovation. You can find more of Meera's work in her newsletter, The Conscious Consumer, on Substack, as well as on Twitter at It's Meera Clark. This episode was edited by Ray Rangel with production support from Celine D'Estasio. If you want to revisit any part of our conversation, you can find the full transcript at vscventures.com. Our thanks to Josue Romero for transcribing and uploading the episodes every week. Lastly, if you've listened this far, please leave us a rating on Spotify or review on iTunes. It takes a few seconds, really helps us out, and as far as I can tell, it's still carbon neutral. That's all for now. We'll see you next week on Climb by VSC.